Imagine you're a Japanese Canadian man in the 1940s. You have a family, property, and a well paying job that can support you and your family. You're a Canadian, proved by your Canadian citizenship and the fact that you were born here in Canada. However, in an act of fear or even racism, the Canadian government decides to remove you, your family, and your personal belongings from your home to a working camp for the rest of World War II. This really happened. To understand why, we have to go back to when the first Japanese landed here in Canada in 1877. Since they first immigrated, Japanese Canadians have suffered from years of racism. White settlers in BC felt as if their way of life was being threatened with so many immigrants arriving. So over time, laws were ruled that denied Japanese Canadians certain government services, plus the right to vote. As time went on, the resentment of Asian immigrants began to grow, and there was even an anti-Asian riot in 1907. When America declared war on Japan on December 8, 1941, people in BC began accusing Japanese Canadians of supporting Japan, or even being potential spies. Following this, anti-Japanese hostilities began erupting predominantly in British Columbia. Canadian industries fired all of their Japanese Canadian workers, and 1,200 fishing boats owned by Japanese fishermen were seized by the government. Civilians and even the news were convinced that Japanese Canadians were in support of Japan, despite the Canadian Army and the Canadian Navy finding no evidence of sabotage or military threat within the Japanese Canadian community. There was no evidence, and yet political leaders in British Columbia and pressure from the press had managed to convince Prime Minister Mackenzie King to intern the Japanese Canadians. On February 24, 1942, an order came from the federal government to remove and detain all Japanese Canadians within 160 kilometers of the Pacific coast. On March 16th, the first Japanese were moved to Hastings Park in Vancouver. They were placed there temporarily, and from there, the women and children were moved to internment camps 200 miles away from the Pacific coast, and the men were sent to work on roads and railways. The camps were crowded, poor, and had no electricity or even running water. To add insult to injury, Canada had also liquidated all Japanese Canadian property and assets, all for the cost of detaining them. By the end of World War II, over 22,000 Japanese Canadians from British Columbia, which was more than 90% of their population, were detained under the War Measures Act and put into internment camps. Now, what was wrong about all of this? From a moral standpoint, the treatment that Japanese Canadians received during World War II was cruel and discriminatory. They were put into internment camps, had their property sold, and were separated from their families under no legal charge. Canada abused the War Measures Act to deny human rights and physically and mentally tainted the Japanese Canadians, all because of quote-unquote safety measures that they may be threats. However, there are no documents or evidence to prove this biased claim. After the war, Canada didn't even apologize to them. Instead, they said that they could either be deported back to Japan or leave British Columbia completely. It was only in 1988, 43 years later, that the Canadian government apologized and started making reparations. In conclusion, Canada during World War II abused their power to deny Japanese Canadians their basic human rights, and at the end of the day, Japanese Canadians did not receive the same respect or equality as other Canadians.